The numbers coming out of Tehran right now, they they aren't just statistics. They're a scream into the void.
Mm.
We're looking at a discrepancy that is honestly hard to wrap your head around. It's the kind of math that just makes your stomach turn.
It is. On one side, you have the official government line from the Islamic Republic.
Right, they're claiming roughly 3,000 casualties since this all really kicked off in late December,
That's the number they're feeding to the UN. It's what you'll see on state TV. 3,000.
which in any other context would already be a humanitarian disaster.
Oh, absolutely. But here, that's the floor. That's the starting point.
Exactly. Because on the other side, leaking through the cracks of what people are calling a digital darkness, we have information suggesting the real number is, well, it's at least 10 times that.
At least. We're seeing specific logs, actual data coming from people on the ground showing over 30,000 deaths.
And not just 30,000 deaths over a month. 30,000 registered in civilian hospitals on just 2 days, January 8th and January 9th.
And that detail, that timeline, it changes the entire nature of what we're witnessing. I mean, think about it. If the official number is 3,000, that's a crackdown. It's brutal, it's tragic, but it fits a certain political category.
But crackdown, yes.
But if the number is 30,000, and specifically 30,000 processed through the medical system in a 48-hour window, that is not a crackdown.
Yeah.
That is a massacre. That is a government waging war against its own population.
And that is exactly what we were going to unpack today. We were looking at Iran in February 2026. This is a moment where the regime seems to be betting its entire survival on a strategy of absolute brutality.
While the rest of the world is playing a very complex, very high-stakes game of geopolitical chess around it.
We're going to talk about the kill switch that has essentially turned the country dark. We'll talk about the foreign militias that are reportedly roaming the streets, and of course this massive U.S. armada that's currently sitting off the coast.
And we have to connect this to the recent past. You really cannot understand January of 2026 without first understanding the 12-day war of June 2025.
So that's the whole stage.
It does. We've got a stack of sources today that is, frankly, it's terrifying, but it's essential reading. We have leaked medical logs that were reported on by Time Magazine and The Guardian. We've got strategic analysis from the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
The Trump administration's brand new 2026 National Defense Strategy, which is a whole topic in itself.
And a really crucial framework from the RAND Corporation on the question of military intervention.
So our mission today is to move beyond the headlines, beyond just the word riots. We want to understand the mechanics of this. How does a government kill 30,000 of its own people in 2 days?
And then what happens next? Does this regime finally fall? Does it, morph into something else, like a military dictatorship?
Or does the world step in? It's the question of the decade, really.
It absolutely is.
So let's start with the immediate situation on the ground, for lack of a better term, the anatomy of a massacre. The thing that really stands out in the reports from Iran International and from Time is the speed.
Yes.
In 2009, you remember, the Green Movement protests simmered for months. In 2019, it was a sudden spike over gas prices. But this feels different.
It's entirely different. The data we're seeing suggests a blitzkrieg strategy, but turned inward against the civilian population. You mentioned those dates, January 8th and 9th. The leaked logs, which came from a network of about 80 medical professionals,
Right.
They indicate that 30,304 deaths were registered in civilian hospitals in just those 48 hours.
I want to pause on that for a second. 30,000 in 48 hours. That's an industrial scale of killing.
It is, and you have to remember, that figure only includes the bodies that were actually brought to hospitals and registered.
So it's an undercount.
It's almost certainly an undercount. It doesn't include those taken directly to morgues by security forces, or those who were, as The Guardian is reporting, buried in mass graves outside the cities.
So this discrepancy between the official 3,000 and the real number, which some opposition sources are now putting north of 36,000 total, it's maintained by a total information blackout.
A complete blackout. We're seeing these reports about a new kill switch project that the government has implemented.
This bunker in Pardis IT town, right?
Exactly. It's a Huawei-based national intranet. So this isn't just them throttling speeds or blocking social media like they did in the past. They are physically severing the country's connection to the global web.
But keeping their own internal network running.
Right, they're halalnet, as some call it. It allows domestic banking to function, government services, the essentials, but it creates a digital iron curtain. It allows them to commit these atrocities in the dark without the videos immediately hitting Twitter.
And the stories that are trickling out of that darkness they're chilling. You mentioned the speed, but there's also a foreign element to the violence this time that we really haven't seen before, or at least not on this scale.
This is a critical differentiator from 2009 or 2019. In previous uprisings, the regime relied heavily on the besieged militia and the regular police.
Their own people, essentially.
Their own people. But there has always been a fear within the regime, a strategic vulnerability they call the conscience factor.
Meaning the fear that an Iranian soldier might hesitate to shoot an Iranian grandmother or a teenager from his own neighborhood.
Precisely. This time, they are not taking that chance. We have confirmed reports from multiple outlets of thousands of foreign fighters being brought in.
And who are these groups?
We're talking about members of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF. We're talking about Lebanese Hezbollah, and then the Afghan Liwa Fatemiyun, and the Pakistani Liwa Zainabiyun brigades.
So these are Shia militias from the region, all under Iran's influence.
All beholden to the IRGC. CNN was reporting that nearly 5,000 Iraqi fighters crossed the border in a single convoy. Iran International has eyewitness accounts from Karaj and several Kurdish regions.
And what are they saying?
They're saying the security forces on the streets were speaking Arabic, not Farsi. There are even reports of them taking selfies with the corpses of protesters.
My God. So we're talking about mercenaries, essentially.
Ideologically driven mercenaries, yes. And when you import a foreign force to quell a domestic uprising, you are doing one thing very deliberately. You are removing hesitation from the equation.
You're bringing in people who view the population not as fellow citizens, but as targets, as the enemy.
As sectarian or political enemies, there's no shared identity to appeal to. It unleashes a different level of brutality.
And that removal of hesitation, it seems to explain the absolute horror of what we're hearing about inside the hospitals. I think this was, for me, the hardest part of the research to get through, this complete violation of medical neutrality.
It's horrific. I mean, a hospital is supposed to be a sanctuary. Even in a declared war, theoretically, it has a protected status.
You don't shoot up a hospital.
You don't. But in this crackdown, hospitals became hunting grounds. We have testimony from doctors, brave people in Tehran and Rash, describing security forces storming their emergency rooms. But it's not just about making arrests.
What are they doing?
They are finding wounded protesters, people who are unconscious, hooked up to monitoring equipment, and they are executing them in their hospital beds.
This is the double tap evidence people are talking about.
Yes. Doctors are seeing bodies arrive in the morgue with medical tubes still inserted, with heart monitoring electrodes still attached to their chests.
Implying they were alive and under medical care.
Exactly. And yet they have fresh gunshot wounds to the head or the heart. A finishing shot.
It's systematic. It's not random violence.
And it's targeted. The medical reports also show specific patterns of injury among protesters who do survive. They're being shot in the eyes, in the genitals. The goal is not just to disperse a crowd. It's to terrorize and mutilate. It's to send a message.
I read one quote from a Tehran doctor that just stuck with me. He said, "Hospitals are no longer sacred."
And when that line is crossed, you know you're in a very, very dark place.
So then this brings us to the big question. Why? Why now? Why this specific level of violence? A regime that feels secure in its power doesn't need to import 5,000 Iraqi militia members.
No, it does.
A regime that feels it has legitimacy doesn't need to execute patients in hospital beds. This feels like panic.
It is panic. And to understand the source of that panic, the brutality of January 2026, you have to look back at the profound humiliation of June 2025.
The 12-day war.
The 12-day war, the conflict with Israel.
Right. And we call it a war, but as the analysis from the Foreign Policy Research Institute points out, it was really a systemic dismantling of Iran's entire military image.
That's a very good way to put it. Israel's Operation Rising Lion didn't just hit targets. It crippled the nuclear facilities at Natanz and Fordo. It killed over 30 senior IRGC and military commanders. But more importantly, it shattered the myth.
The myth of the Ring of Fire.
Exactly. For decades, the Islamic Republic projected this image of a powerful deterrent, this massive missile arsenal that could rain down on Tel Aviv, this network of proxies surrounding Israel. It was the core of their strategic doctrine.
And when push came to shove?
It was a house of cards. The FPRI analysis uses the term paper tiger. Their much vaunted missiles were intercepted by advanced defense systems, their command and control structure was decapitated in hours, and they looked utterly incompetent on the world stage.
There's a term the expert used in that piece, the dumbification of the IRGC.
Yes, and it's a fascinating concept. The idea that for 40 years, loyalty to the revolution was prized so far above actual competence.
That when a real modern war started, they simply couldn't fight it effectively.
They couldn't. I mean, you have to remember, this is the same IRGC that a few years ago was proudly unveiling a corona finder.
I remember that story. It was a handheld device that supposedly detected COVID-19 from 100 meters away.
Right. It was a scam, a piece of junk science, sold to the highest levels of the IRGC. Now, that's funny in a dark way, but it illustrates the rot. If your top generals can be duped by a snake oil salesman with a fake gadget.
How are they going to manage a complex, integrated air defense system against the Israeli Air Force?
They couldn't. So you fast forward to January 2026. The regime is profoundly humiliated. They've just lost the external war in a spectacular fashion. They absolutely cannot afford to lose the internal one.
So they're lashing out with maximum force because it's the only tool they have left that works, brute force.
It's all they have. They can't win on competence, so they're trying to win on fear.
And in the middle of all this, where is the supreme leader? Where's Ali Khamenei?
That's the other power vacuum. He has, for the most part, disappeared from public view. The reports we're seeing suggest he's in a deep, secure bunker, terrified of the same kind of targeted assassination campaign that took out so many of his top commanders last year.
So the cult of personality is crumbling.
It's in tatters. When you're the supreme leader and you lead your country into a catastrophic military defeat, that aura of divine guidance and invincibility, it just evaporates.
And we're seeing signs of a power struggle within the elite.
We are. The reemergence of Ali Khamenei is a huge signal. Here's a guy who was a pillar of the establishment, then was sidelined, disqualified from running for president. Now suddenly he's back as the head of the Supreme National Security Council.
What does that tell you?
It tells you the elite are scrambling. They're looking for someone, anyone, who might have the credibility or the connections to hold the ship together as it's taking on water. It's a sign of desperation.
And ideologically, they're scrambling too. This is a really interesting point in the readings, this shift from Islamism to nationalism.
It's a last-ditch pivot. For 40 years, the Islamic Republic has systematically downplayed pre-Islamic Persian history and nationalism in favor of a pan-Islamic, specifically Shia, identity.
Right, they saw it as a rival ideology.
A threat, even. Now, suddenly, with their religious legitimacy in ruins, they're trying to wave the flag and paint the protesters as agents of Israel and the U.S., trying to rally people around the motherland.
The irony is just, it's incredibly thick.
It's profound. They are trying to use the very nationalism they tried to suppress for 4 decades to save the theocracy that suppressed it.
But the people in the streets aren't buying it.
Not at all. You listen to the slogans being chanted. It's not death to America anymore. It's death to the dictator. It's our enemy is right here. They lie when they say it's America. They have correctly identified the source of their misery.
So the regime is cornered. It's humiliated. It's lashing out internally. Now let's pivot and look at the external chessboard. You have this slaughter happening in broad daylight, or at least in the digital twilight. And you look at Israel. The regime is wobbling. Israel just wrecked their military and nuclear program 6 months ago. Why isn't Israel attacking right now? Why not deliver the knockout blow?
This is what analysts are calling restraint as strategy. And it's a very cold, calculated move by Netanyahu's government. Think it through. If Israeli jets start bombing Tehran right now, while the streets are full of protesters, what happens?
It validates the regime's entire propaganda narrative.
100%. Suddenly, the regime can turn to the people and say, see, we told you these rioters were Zionist puppets. Our sacred homeland is under attack. It would be the greatest gift they could possibly receive.
It would give the IRGC a chance to rally a segment of the population against an external enemy.
It would change the subject instantly. Israel's calculation is, it's cruel, but it's strategically sound. Don't interrupt your enemy when they are in the process of destroying themselves.
Let the internal rot finish the job that the airstrikes started.
Exactly. Let the regime collapse under the weight of its own brutality and incompetence.
But there are risks to that strategy, surely.
Huge risks. The biggest risk is that the regime doesn't collapse. It survives, battered and bloodied, and then what? Then it might feel it has absolutely nothing to lose and makes a desperate sprint for a nuclear breakout. Or it could lash out regionally to create a distraction. It's a massive gamble.
So Israel sits back and watches. But the United States, That's a completely different story. We have the Trump administration back in office, and we have this new 2026 National Defense Strategy, the NDS. This document is fascinating because it seemed to say one thing, while U.S. actions are saying the complete opposite.
It's a classic Trump-era paradox, isn't it? The 2026 NDS, if you read the text, is a very clear, almost purely isolationist document.
It's all about homeland defense.
Right. It explicitly says the U.S. should prioritize the Western Hemisphere, focus on border security and domestic issues, and deprioritize military engagements in the Middle East and Europe. But in the real world, President Trump has just ordered what he called a massive armada, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, to reposition from the South China Sea directly to the Persian Gulf.
And he's posting on Truth Social things like, help is on the way.
He is. And he's publicly comparing the situation in Iran to Venezuela, which, for this administration, has always been code for regime change being on the table.
So which is it? Is it America first, stay home? Or is it we are coming to liberate Tehran?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question that is keeping strategists up at night in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Moscow, in Beijing. Everybody is trying to figure this out.
What's the analysis? Is this just a bluff?
The analysis from the Council on Foreign Relations suggests a couple of possibilities. One is that Trump views Iran as the great exception to his isolationist NDS, that this one regime is so uniquely problematic that the doctrine doesn't apply.
And the other possibility?
Is that it's the biggest leverage play in modern history. He's not necessarily planning an invasion, but he's putting a carrier strike group on their doorstep to force a deal.
A deal for what? The reporting on this is interesting. They're not saying the U.S. is demanding democracy.
No, the leaks suggest the demands are very hard-nosed and pragmatic. 3 things. 1, verifiably and permanently end the nuclear weapons program. 2, dismantle the long-range ballistic missile program. And 3, cut off all funding and support for proxy groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the PMF.
That's it. Just disarm, and you can stay in power and do what you want to your own people.
That appears to be the deal on the table. But here's the problem from the regime's perspective. Those 3 things, nukes, missiles, and proxies, are the very pillars of their power and their identity.
Giving them up is a form of suicide for them.
It's regime suicide, just a slower version. So
Right.
you have an armada sailing toward a regime that feels it has nothing left to lose and is being offered a deal it cannot possibly accept. It's an incredibly volatile situation.
And while the ships are sailing, the economic war is already escalating to a new level. Trump's use of secondary tariffs. This isn't just the old sanctions playbook. This is something else entirely.
This is economic strangulation, pure and simple. The administration has imposed a 25% tariff. But here's the crucial part, the part people need to understand. It doesn't just apply to Iran. It applies to anyone who trades with Iran.
So it's really aimed at China.
It is primarily aimed at China. China is Iran's biggest customer. They buy about 1.3 million barrels of Iranian oil every single day. They are the regime's economic lifeline.
So what Trump is telling Beijing is, if you want to keep buying that oil, fine. But every single thing you sell to the United States, iPhones, electronics, clothing, everything, is going to get hit with a 25% tariff.
And China's economy is far too dependent on the U.S. market to absorb that kind of hit. So what do? They're not going to stop buying the oil entirely because they need the energy.
They'll demand a discount.
A massive discount. They'll go to Tehran and say, look, if we're going to take this tariff risk and deal with the political headache, you need to sell us this oil for 50, maybe 70% below market price.
So Iran ends up bearing the entire cost of the tariff.
Precisely. The buyer is insulated, and the seller gets pennies on the dollar. It's a way to completely asphyxiate the regime's cash flow right at the moment they need that money the most to pay those foreign militias and keep their security forces loyal. It is a full-blown economic siege.
So we have a siege, we have an armada on the horizon, we have an internal massacre. The question on everyone's mind becomes, does the U.S. intervene militarily? Does this end with cruise missiles hitting Tehran?
This is where we looked at that RAND Corporation study, assessing trade-offs in U.S. military intervention. It's not about Iran specifically, but it lays out a framework for making exactly this kind of decision.
And when you apply that framework to Iran in 2026,
the warning lights start flashing red all over the dashboard. The first thing RAND talks about is the early versus late trade-off. They argue that early, decisive interventions can sometimes succeed, but they're a huge bet with very high upfront costs. Late interventions after a conflict is already raging are often messy, ineffective, and can even make things worse.
And we are definitely in the late phase here. The crackdown is fully engaged.
Oh, absolutely. But the bigger problem, according to the RAND framework, is what they call the spoiler factor.
The spoilers being.
Well, in this case, it's a long list. It's those 5,000 plus foreign militia fighters we already talked about. Hezbollah, the PMF. They are highly motivated, ideologically driven spoilers who would fight a U.S. intervention tooth and nail.
And it's not just them on the ground.
No. You also have the potential for major state spoilers. Russia or China could provide diplomatic cover at the UN, or worse, provide intelligence, weapons, or cyber support to the regime. RAND warns that when you have highly motivated third-party spoilers, the cost of an intervention skyrockets and the probability of success plummets.
And then there's the legitimacy problem. This was brought up really well in the Eurasia Review article. Let's say the U.S. does go in, the regime collapses, and Washington tries to install a new government.
It looks like 1953 all over again.
The CIA coup that overthrew Mossadegh and reinstated the Shah. It's the original sin of U.S.-Iran relations.
It is. And if the U.S. installs a new government, even if it's led by a popular and respected figure like the exiled Prince Reza Pahlavi, it immediately risks being labeled a puppet regime. It undermines the organic, homegrown nature of the revolution itself.
The Eurasia Review piece made a really strong point about that. It called it the danger of creating a client state 2.0.
And that gives the remnants of the IRGC a ready-made insurgency. Imagine the IRGC not as a government, but as a powerful guerrilla force, still controlling maybe 50% of the country's economy, wrapping themselves in the flag of nationalism and claiming they're fighting imperialist puppets.
You could turn Iran into Iraq post-2003. A catastrophic, decades-long insurgency.
That is the nightmare scenario. A failed state with a population of 80 million people. It would be a disaster on a scale we can barely comprehend.
So if a full-scale invasion is off the table, or at least a terrifically bad idea, where does this go? The sources laid out a few potential scenarios for the future.
Right. Scenario A, and maybe the most depressing one, is the Venezuelan model. The regime survives. It survives through sheer, unrestrained brutality. They kill enough people, they lock down the country completely, and they manage to cling to power.
Creating a zombie state.
Exactly. Isolated, sanctioned, impoverished, a pariah, but still in power.
Bleak. What's scenario B?
Scenario B is a military dictatorship. In this version, the clerical facade finally collapses. The Ayatollahs are pushed aside or fade into ceremonial roles, and the IRGC takes formal, overt control of the state.
They drop the pretense of it being an Islamic Republic.
They do. They just rule openly as a military junta, which, you could argue, is what they have been doing behind the scenes for years. This would just make it official.
Okay, scenario C.
Scenario C is probably the most chaotic. It's the Syria scenario, or collapse and fracture. The central authority in Tehran completely breaks. The military splinters. The country then fractures along its ethnic and geographic fault lines.
So you'd see the Kurds in the west breaking away, the Baluchis in the southeast.
Arabs in the southwest. It could become a patchwork of warring fiefdoms, exacerbated by a massive power vacuum and weapons flooding the country. It would be a humanitarian catastrophe.
And finally, scenario D, the optimistic one.
The optimistic one, relatively speaking, scenario D is the restoration. The regime collapses from within under the weight of the protests and economic pressure. A transitional government takes over, maybe an interim council symbolized by a figurehead like Reza Pahlavi, with the goal of holding free and fair elections.
This is the dream of the protesters on the street.
It is, but as we've discussed, it's a very delicate path. It requires the regime to crumble from within without the U.S. fingerprints being too heavy on the process to avoid that puppet label.
It feels like the entire country and the region is walking a tightrope between those four outcomes right now.
A very, very thin rope.
And while we analyze all this geopolitics, I want to bring it back to the street for a moment, back to the human element, because the psychology of these protests feels fundamentally different this time.
It absolutely is.
In 2009, the slogan was, "Where is my vote?" It was a reformist movement. It was people who believed in the system, but felt an election had been stolen.
2009 was about fixing the system. 2026 is about burning the system to the ground. That is a revolutionary shift, not a reformist one.
The fear is still there, of course. You can feel it in the descriptions we're reading of the de facto curfew in Tehran and Karaj, the eerie silence on the streets after dark.
Of course, the fear is there when you have death squads roaming the hospitals, but the nature of the defiance is different, too. It's deeper.
The reports about people dancing at funerals.
Yes, that's a profound cultural and political act. There are videos shared before the blackout of people dancing at the funerals of slain protesters. They are rejecting the regime's entire culture of mourning and martyrdom. They're celebrating a life lived in defiance, not mourning a death in submission. It's incredibly powerful.
And the symbols are changing. The return of the lion and sun flag.
The pre-revolutionary flag. You see it everywhere now. It represents a longing for a different Iran, a connection to a past that was more secular, more nationalist, more normal.
A normal country.
That's what so many people say they want. And you see it in the specific calls for Reza Pahlavi. In the past, these uprisings were often criticized, even from the outside, for being leaderless.
Right. There was no single figure to rally around.
Exactly. Now, for the first time in a major way, there is a focal point, a name, that makes the movement more cohesive, and for the regime, it makes it infinitely more dangerous.
We're almost out of time, but I want to make sure we hit the so what question for our listeners.
Yeah.
Why does this crisis in Iran matter if you're listening to this in, say, Ohio or Germany?
It matters for three very concrete reasons.
Yeah.
The first is energy security. The Strait of Hormuz.
20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passes right through that choke point.
And a significant portion of the world's oil. If a desperate, dying Iranian regime decides to mine the strait as a final act of defiance, global energy prices don't just rise, they skyrocket. Your gas bill, your heating bill, the cost of all goods, the entire global economy takes a massive, massive hit.
Okay, that's reason one. Reason two.
Nuclear proliferation. We know from the IAEA that before the 12-day war, Iran had amassed roughly 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity.
Which is very close to weapons grade.
A screwdriver's turn away, as they say. If the regime feels it is truly dying, if the U.S. armada is off the coast, if the protesters are at the palace gates, do they make a final, desperate dash for a bomb? Do they try to use what they have as the ultimate poison pill? A dying, cornered regime with near-weapons-grade nuclear material is one of the most dangerous things imaginable.
And third reason.
It's the moral weight. It's the concept of R2P, the responsibility to protect. After the genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica, the world came together and said that national sovereignty has its limits.
That a government does not have the right to slaughter its own people behind the shield of sovereignty.
Exactly. And so you have to ask the question, if a state kills 30,000 of its own citizens in 48 hours, does it still get to claim the protections of sovereignty? If the world watches this happen and does nothing, what message does that send to every other dictator and autocrat who is watching this unfold?
That is the heavy question hanging over all of this. So, to try and wrap this all up, we are witnessing a race. It's a race between the internal collapse of a humiliated, brutalized regime
and the external pressure from a world, particularly the United States, that is frankly tired of its aggression and nuclear brinksmanship.
The 12-day war last year broke the regime's armor. It exposed them as weak.
And these massacres, I would argue, have broken its soul. It has no legitimacy left, not even among many of its former supporters. It's ruling by pure force.
But history teaches us that broken regimes, soulless regimes, can limp on for years, even decades, if the world blinks.
Look at Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. Look at Maduro in Caracas. Survival is possible, even in a zombie state.
So the question isn't just, will the regime fall? But maybe more importantly, what rises from the ashes? Is it an IRGC military junta, which could be even more brutally efficient? Is it a fractured civil war like Syria?
Or is it finally a free Iran? And the biggest wildcard of all in that equation, is that U.S. armada actually coming to help midwife a new Iran, or is it just coming to watch the old one burn?
That is what we have to wait and see. The signals we get in the coming weeks will be crucial.
They will be.
Keep your eyes on the silence coming out of Tehran. Sometimes the silence tells you more than the noise. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Thank you.